Hello everybody, my name is Jean-François Maes and I am the Director of Advanced Assessments in Europe for Neuvik, which is a US-based consultancy that recently opened a subsidiary in Europe, and we specialize in offensive security as well as risk assessments. And today I am going to give you a presentation that I think is very relevant. I've been in this industry for a number of years now, and I basically came to the conclusion that I feel that a lot of our assessments have the same findings, it's just a different organization. So in order to give back to the community, give back to the industry in general, we thought it was a good idea to just take a look at some of the findings that we very commonly find in internal pen tests as well as red teams, and how you could potentially remediate some of these already, which is going to basically be free consultancy advice, right? There you go. And hopefully that is going to help protect organizations against some of the more common vulnerabilities that we see, hopefully increasing the difficulty for bad actors to compromise these environments, including maybe your environment as well if you are watching this particular webcast. So first of all, why should we care about this? Well, as I said, I have a pretty decent background in internal pen testing as well as penetration testing and red teaming in general. I've been doing this for over 7 years now, but actually it's almost closer to a decade. And as I said already, right, we find the same things over and over again. And at first I thought it was just me, that I'm just a little bit of a cynical person, right? Because obviously I only have my own customers, and maybe that's just our customers, right? Maybe it's just a common theme that our customers have that problem. So I thought, okay, in order to make sure that this is more scientifically proven, right, I'm just going to launch a little bit of a X poll, previously Twitter, right, where I asked the question to my audience, to my followers. I said, hey, if you're in infosec for a while, do you feel like you find the same findings over and over again, but just from a different point of view, different organizations? It turns out, yes, in fact, most of the people that responded voted, yeah, we see that too. And the thing is, most of these things that I'm going to be talking about are relatively straightforward to fix. Not necessarily completely get rid of, but you could at least reduce costs or mitigate risk by implementing some pretty easy configuration settings that are automatically already going to make you a lot more secure. Worst case scenario, even if you don't walk away from this presentation with anything applicable, well, at least you now have insight on what most common vulnerabilities are in organizations and how you could potentially remediate some of these. Now, the reason I started making this presentation, I'll be very honest, is because, again, I see a lot of the same things work over and over and over again in my own engagements. Now, when I started my infosec journey, when I started doing internal penetration testing, I came across a blog post by a Bytebleeder, also known as Marcello, who released a blog post on practical guides to NTLM relaying in 2017. I used that blog post pretty much step by step. It's a step-by-step guide, and that worked for me. That works for me quite efficiently. And the problem is, right, fast forward, we are 2024, so a number of years after this blog post, and these things still work. Yeah, that's problematic. In fact, I updated this particular blog post when I was working at TrustedSec a number of years ago. I think 2022, maybe 2023. Where I gave additional insights in how to perform some of these attacks. But short case, it is still working, right? So that is a problem. So let's dive into some of the more basic things first before we start tackling NTLM relaying, which is passwords. Now, for a number of years, us as a security industry, not just me or my consultancy firms that I used to work for or still work for, we basically, as an industry, said to our clients, hey, you need to increase your password complexity. You need to make sure that you rotate your passwords frequently. And it turns out that by giving this advice, which we thought a number of years ago was good advice, we actually made some organizations get a false sense of security, if you will. Because yes, I will be honest, most organizations nowadays, the ones that we assess at least, have a password policy, which is great. That's good, which contains rules that password need to oblige by. For example, you need to have a lowercase and an uppercase character. Maybe you need to have a number or even a special character in your password. Maybe you have a password length that you need to adhere to. Instead of being able to set a password for 7 characters, maybe your organization requires you to have at least 12 or maybe even 16 or 24, right? So most organizations nowadays do have that password complexity, which is great. However, it's not as great as it first seems. Why not? Well, I can bet you that I can use some psychic powers, right, to define or to guess some of the characteristics that you, the person watching this webcast, or some people in your organization might have in their passwords if you are complying through some kind of password policy. Pay close attention, right? How do we get better at these passwords? Well, very simple, don't use one. Use biometrics if you can, because those are going to be better. Smart cards, exactly the same. If a password does require authentication, if you need authentication through a password, then enable multi-factor authentication. But choosing your multi-factor authentication is also going to be important. We're going to talk more about that later, as not all multi-factor authentication are going to be as secure. Now, another thing that we preached for as an industry was password age, right? Rotate passwords every now and then. Now, science has proven that this is not going to be very useful. In fact, when I talk more about my psychic powers that I just talked about earlier, you're going to see why that is, right? You might not want a password age and instead just force people to change their password in case that password is observed in a password breach, for example. Now, password managers are great, right? We as an industry are preaching for people to start using password managers, but that's not going to be a silver bullet. Your password manager is only as secure as the master password that you are using to secure the passwords. So for those of you who are unaware, a password manager is a piece of software that you install, could also be an application on your phone, that is going to be like a vault, right? So you need a login, typically your email address, followed by a password to unlock your vault. Inside of your vault, you will have passwords. Now, these passwords can be random, can be randomly generated, can be very long, can be very secure, very complex, because you don't need to remember them, right? You can simply open up your vault, retrieve the password, copy paste it in the web-based environment or wherever you have to authenticate to, and you will be able to do that. So this increases your security and decreases the complexity of authentication, because now you don't have to remember all these passwords. However, as I just mentioned, you need some kind of master password to unlock that vault. So if your master password is not secure and your master password is, for example, password 1 or let me in 123, well, guess what? Adversaries will be able to figure that out as well. If they can get remote code execution on your systems, they can potentially grab your password vault database. They could exfiltrate that to their attacker-controlled machine and then try to brute force their way into that vault. If your master password isn't secure, that now means that all of the cryptographically secure passwords are at risk, right? Because if an adversary can open your password vault, well, then they will be able to authenticate to you. On top of that, password vaults can also have CVEs, right? It's still software. They might contain vulnerabilities. Some password managers out there are notorious for keeping the master password stored in clear text in memory, for example, for as long as the password vault is open. So you have to really decide, okay, do you need passwords? If so, a password manager is definitely going to help you, but if you can get rid of passwords and if you can go to a full passwordless model where you could use biometrics or smart cards or multi-factor authentication tokens to log in, that is going to be a lot easier. Okay, so I promised you some psychic powers, right? So I'm going to do that right now. So if your organization has a password policy and your password policy requires you to have a special character in your passwords, I can bet you that that special character is going to be your final character in your passwords. And I can bet you even more. I bet you that your special character is either going to be an exclamation mark or a question mark. Now, if you also require capital characters in your passwords, so if your password policy says no, you have to have at least one uppercase character, I can bet you that the vast majority of you will have that uppercase character as the first character of your password. And then if your password requires numbers for any reason, it's likely that those numbers are going to be at the very end of your password, but before your special character. And then and that's what I mentioned before, right? If you are forced by your organization to rotate your passwords, what very often happens is people will just increment or decrement a number by 1, right? So instead of summer 2024, it might now be summer 2025, right? So as you can see, that's not going to be the best idea for passwords. In fact, if we take a look at the top 10 most common passwords in 2024, you can see that this is not great, right? So even now, we are that many numbers of years in, right? People still aren't doing passwords properly. So that is, of course, quite problematic. But that's not the only problem. I talked about multi-factor authentication. Now, multi-factor authentication is great. For those of you who are not very sure what multi-factor authentication is basically going to combine something you know, right? So your password, with something you have. For example, your mobile phone, which might have an authenticator application. Or maybe you have a little hardware token, a key fob that you could have on your keychain, right? Which has a number that you can use as multi-factor authentication. Could also be something you are, right? For example, you could use your thumbprint as multi-factor authentication. You could use your iris scan as multi-factor authentication as well. So there's a variety of things that you could do to have more than just your passwords. That being said, using your voice, for example, is not a great idea. Not that long ago, a US institution for veterans actually announced on Twitter or X, right, that they are now accepting your voice as a multi-factor authentication. Now, why is this problematic? Well, nowadays, right, we are in the rise of artificial intelligence. We are in the rise of deepfakes. So an adversary nowadays only needs about 60 seconds of your voice to make you say whatever they want you to say. In fact, when I looked at the statistics, I actually came across an article from McAfee that says that artificial intelligent voice scams are on the rise, with as many as 1 in 4 at this point in time of adults that are being impacted. So artificial voice scams are already impacting about 25% of adults nowadays. So as you can see, not every single multi-factor authentication is going to be great. In fact, there are a few bad examples. For example, voice cloning, right? We just talked about that. But it could also be your location. Some multi-factor authentication applications also take a look at your geolocation to pretty much use that as a second factor. Now, this is not going to work very well because we can, of course, spoof our location. We could, for example, use a VPN to masquerade ourselves so we look like we are in another country. So that is also not going to be a good way of multi-factor authentication either. So I mentioned a few bad examples, right? So what are some good examples? Well, some good examples, again, are going to be tokens, right? Something that is rotating every now and then and that can't easily be spoofed. For example, our mobile applications, authenticator apps, might have a number on the screen. You can actually see that on the slide as well. It's a number, typically 6 digits, could be 8 as well. And it's going to have a little timer, either 1 minute, maybe 30 seconds. And every 1 minute or 30 seconds or whatever time delta is chosen, that code is going to rotate, right? So it's not easy to simply brute force from an adversarial perspective. Now, another way of doing this multi-factor authentication would be a push notification on your phone, right? So if you try to log in, you put in your username, your password, and you hit that multi-factor authentication, there might be on your screen a number, for example, 82, right? You'll have to open up your mobile application, right? Your mobile authenticator, and you will have to type in the number 82 as well to confirm that you are trying to log in as that particular user on that particular website. Now, rolling codes or hardware tokens are great, but once again, biometrics work just as well. A lot of laptops nowadays have built-in thumb readers or have a webcam that you could use for Windows Hello for biometrics. So that is also a good way of doing multi-factor authentication. Now, another problem that organizations tend to have is they are pretty good, which is good, in securing their external perimeter. Great, right? External perimeter, reasonably well secured, if not very well secured. That's awesome, but that's only half the battle, right? Organizations typically don't just have external facing infrastructure. They will also have internal facing infrastructure. And typically, if we start looking under the hood, right? So if we get that internal perspective, that's where things get messy, right? That's where things go wrong. That's where we find these outdated systems, these applications which are written maybe 20 years ago, which might have vulnerabilities like SQL injection, maybe default passwords like admin, right? So we're going to talk about some of these things later on in this presentation as well. Now, the first common vulnerability or finding that we see from an internal pen testing perspective is legacy protocols. Now, typically speaking, there are two problematic protocols that we see very often in internal environments. And those are going to be link local multicast name resolution or LLMNR and net BIOS name server or NBNS. Now, these two legacy protocols are fallback protocols to the DNS protocol, right? The domain name resolution protocol. So what is the problem here? Well, the fact that if DNS can't resolve a domain name, it's going to fall back on these protocols. And these protocols are broadcast protocols. What that means is everybody that is connected to the same network as the computer that is trying to resolve something that can be resolved from the DNS server is going to get a message from that computer. That computer is going to ask everybody in the environment, hey, does anybody know what this particular IP is, what this particular fully qualified domain name is? If something in the environment then replies to the DNS query, well, to the LLMNR query or the NBNS query, then that protocol, because again, it's legacy, it's old, security wasn't as big of a concern as it is now, that protocol is going to be naive and is not going to ask the actual person, or in this case, the computer that responds, to validate if they are in fact who they say they are. So as long as something replies to that particular broadcast message, the protocol is going to assume that they are telling the truth. And that is, of course, not great from a security perspective. Why is that a problem? Well, broadcasts can be replied to. If the protocol isn't checking any identities, it's going to naively trust anything that is responding to the network, which is a little bit of a pun, right? A little bit of tongue-in-cheek humor, as the most well-known tool that we use from an internal pen test perspective to poison this traffic is called responder. So again, what we do here from an internal pen test perspective is we have an attacker-controlled machine on the network, right? So we plug in a Raspberry Pi or a small laptop or maybe a Dropbox, right? A NUC into the same network as the users of that organization. We start listening passively on the wire. So we're just listening. We're sniffing packets. If we see that broadcast protocols, these broadcast protocols generating traffic, well, we could start replying to that traffic, which is then going to allow us to force people to authenticate to us, potentially either leaking their net NTLM v1 or v2 hashes, which we could potentially try and decrypt by performing a brute force attack against them, or we could also perform an NTLM relaying attack, which is that first slide that I talked about that worked in 2017. Well, it still works nowadays as well. Now, another problem that we have in organizations is IPv6. Now, IPv6 is a great invention. So IPv6 was invented because the IPv4 public address space is limited. So we are hitting that limit, meaning there are not a lot of IPv4 addresses available anymore publicly facing. Now, what the problem here is that most organizations aren't using IPv6 internally, right? Most organizations, if not all organizations, will have enough private IPv4 addresses to network all of their machines. Now, the problem here is if you are not using IPv6 internally, the problem is that most computers that you buy nowadays will be configured by default on their network interfaces to try and obtain an IPv6 address. The reason is because IPv6 is newer technology than IPv4. So by default, your servers in your environment and your workstations in your environment will have that IPv6 discovery turned on by design. Now, this could be problematic. Why is that the case? Well, if we try to obtain an IP address, that is being done using yet another protocol, right? The DHCP protocol. DHCP is going to dynamically give you an IP address. Now, DHCP does not just assign you an IP address, it can also assign you a DNS server. Now, since IPv6 is a thing, right, and DHCP provisions IPv4 addresses, shouldn't come as a surprise that there is also a DHCP version 6, which is going to manage IPv6 addresses. Now, the problem here is if your computer or your server is configured to try and obtain an IPv6 address, your computer or server is going to send out a DHCP v6 request. It's going to ask on the network, hey network, does anybody here have the capability to give me an IPv6 address? Now, typically speaking, if your organization is not using IPv6, nothing is going to reply to that. However, from an adversarial perspective, once again, if we have a foothold in the environment, we could start replying to those DHCP v6 requests. And we could tell every computer, dear computer, this is your IPv6 address. Oh, and by the way, this is going to be your new DNS server. And that DNS server would be pointing to us, right? To our attacker-controlled infrastructure. Meaning all traffic that requires DNS is now going to be flowing through us. Now, why is that the case? Well, because IPv6 is newer than IPv4. That means that IPv6 will always take precedence over IPv4. So that means if we have a DNS server that is provisioned to us by DHCP version 6, and we have another DNS server by DHCP, then the DNS server that was provided to us using DHCP v6 will have the priority over the other DNS servers, allowing us to hijack traffic and once again force authentication to our attacker-controlled environment. Now, once again, this is going to give us the opportunity to capture net NTLM v2 or sometimes even v1 hashes, which again, we could be using to brute force our way into the environment, revealing plain text credentials if the password is sufficiently weak, or we could perform an NTLM relaying attack. Now, that's not the only problem. There are some other problems as well. For example, printers, right? Printers are the hardware that gives everybody nightmares if you are in IT, right? No matter how experienced you are, there's always going to be a printer problem. Now, the problem here is not the actual physical printer. Well, actually, that could be a problem as well. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. But here, the problem lies in the print spooler service on computers. A number of years ago, the folks over at SpectreOps, which is another consultancy firm, did excellent research on coercing authentication. And they figured out, alongside with a Dutch security researcher called Dirk Jan, that there are some protocols out there that we could potentially use to coerce authentication from an adversarial perspective. And one of those things is leveraging the printer bug. Now, what is the printer bug? Well, the printer bug is going to be abusing a flaw in the printer service, which is by default running on all workstations and all servers, including your domain controllers. What this service is doing is, because it's a service, it's running as anti-authority system. So it's running under the highest privileges on that particular machine. Now, what this service is waiting for is for someone to authenticate to that particular service over a named pipe, and is going to wait until someone requests something from that service. For example, we could say, "Dear computer, you have an interesting document that I would like to print. Please give me that document." And because the computer is running that service under the computer account, that means that we are going to be triggering a forced authentication from that computer account to our attacker-controlled machines. This could be problematic, again, because now we could potentially once again perform NTLM relaying, or sometimes, if the machines are misconfigured or are that old, like Windows XP and Windows 2003, we might be able to force them into NTLM v1. Now, NTLM v1 is horrible. Why? Because NTLM v1 is using very weak encryption. Such outdated encryption, in fact, that brute forcing an NTLM v1 hash can be done in a number of seconds, right? So it does not take long at all. Now, if an adversary can successfully decrypt an NTLM v1 hash, they will be able to take over that particular computer. So if that would be a domain controller, for example, that could be very, very problematic for organizations. Now, I mentioned the actual physical printers can be problematic as well. Why is that the case? Well, if we have computers that need to print, that might be that the printer is going to be connected to the domain using LDAP, right? So LDAP is the protocol that we use to query Active Directory, and LDAP has an LDAP and an LDAP-S variant. So the LDAP variant is plain text, the LDAP-S variant is using encryption. Now, some of these printers can connect using LDAP, so the plain text version, to Active Directory, meaning they will be domain joined. Now, sometimes these printers will have a settings page allowing you to specify the server and the port, as well as the username and the password. Now, the thing that we want to update here is not the password, but the server address. We could set the server address on the admin panel of the printer to an attacker-controlled machine. And on the attacker-controlled machine, we would then have to just simply set up a listener, right? Listening on traffic that is inbound on the LDAP port, which by design, by default, is port 389. So if we can get incoming traffic to that port, that's going to be in plain text. So if we can trigger authentication, that would reveal to us the plain text password of that particular account, which we can then, of course, use from an authenticated perspective in the environment as well. And then we talked about relays a few times. So what exactly are relays? Well, relays are going to be the crowd favorite of internal pen testers and sometimes even red teamers as well. Why? Because it works in the vast majority of the time. How does it work? Well, it abuses NTLM authentication to trick computers into thinking that we are in fact someone else. Now, this particular technique relies on two findings, which are very similar yet slightly different, which is the fact that LDAP signing is typically not enforced in environments, and SMB signing is typically also not enforced in environments. Now, if these signing mechanisms are not enforced, that means that LDAP and SMB are not actually going to check the integrity of the message. Meaning, if we get a challenge and we submit the response, the actual server is not going to check if the same user that was used to get the challenge is going to provide the response, which means we can now do a man-in-the-middle attack. So how does that work? Well, I'm going to first skip over this slide. I'll get back to it and first talk about this. So NTLM authentication is a challenge response protocol, meaning the server and the client are going to be talking to each other. The client is going to tell the server, "Dear server, I am the client. I would like to authenticate to you." The server is going to tell the client, "Dear client, I don't know that you are in fact client. I will give you a challenge, and if you are in fact client, you should give me a response, which only you should know." So the client is going to give the response to the server, and then the server is going to check, well, in fact, it's the domain controller, which is going to check if that challenge response code is correct. If the challenge response code is correct, then the client gets authenticated access to the server. Now, if SMB signing or LDAP signing is not turned on, that now means that we could fool the client into thinking that we are the server, and we could fool the server into thinking that we are the client. So how does that work? Well, the client is going to want to authenticate to the server. Now, here we used a man-in-the-middle position, right? So, for example, using IPv6 attacks or using LLMNR or NBNS poisoning to trick the client into thinking that we are the server, right? So the client is going to authenticate to us, and it's going to give us a response, right? It's going to first try to authenticate to us. We're going to forward that authentication to the server that we want to access. That server is going to give us a response, a challenge that we are going to forward, right? So server gives us a secret that we must solve, a puzzle. We are going to forward that to the client. The client is going to solve that puzzle for us because the client is, of course, the client. And we're simply going to tell the client, "Hey, this is good," right? But we are going to forward that to the actual server, and we are going to pretend that we are the client, right? So from an authenticated perspective, the server is going to think we are the client and we'll get access to the actual server, and the server is not going to check that we are in fact client, because we fooled the client into thinking we are the server, and we fooled the server into thinking we are the client, because again, the message integrity is not being checked, right? So the flow can be manipulated by adversaries. Now, what are some of the impacts here? Well, the impact depends on which users we are lucky enough from an internal or red team perspective to coerce authentication from. So worst case scenario, if we are able to relay from SMB to SMB, we can compromise the server that we were able to relay to. Now, sometimes we want to relay across protocols. For example, we might want to relay to the HTTP protocol, for example, if ADCS is in the environment. ADCS is an abbreviation which stands for Active Directory Certificate Services, which I'm going to be talking about later on. In some instances, we might also want to relay to the LDAP or even the LDAP-S service as well. So depending on which target we can relay to and which victim we were able to compromise this way, we can either compromise a system, or we could, in some rare instances, from just a NTLM relay, compromise the entire domain as well. Now, I actually recorded a SANS workshop, right? A SANS workshop, NTLM Relaying 101, which you would be able to follow along. Now, I realize that the webcam is in front of the QR code, so the slides will very likely be published somewhere, allowing you to scan that QR code. Or if you just simply Google SANS workshop NTLM relaying, you would be able to find it as well. Now, to demonstrate some of the impact, I have some recordings of me performing some of the attacks, right? So here I'm setting up my NTLM relaying tool, and I'm going to relay to the LDAP service on a domain controller in my environment. In this case, what I'm going to be doing is I will set up my listener, waiting for incoming connections, and once a connection is received, I will forward that connection to our domain controller, specifically to the LDAP service. Now, what I need to do now is I need to coerce authentication from a victim. We can do that using a number of tools. We talked about man-in-the-middle 6. We talked about using the print spooler. We can also use a tool called Petit Potam, which is another RPC call, another remote procedure call that we could use to coerce authentication. Now, depending on which protocol you want to relay to, you might not always be able to relay from one protocol to another protocol. So in this case, what I need to do is I need to authenticate using HTTP, because I need to have HTTP authentication to be able to successfully relay to the actual LDAP server. Now, as you can see, I was able to relay to the LDAP server, and the LDAP server itself will then dump the domain. Now, this is not a password dump, right? This is simply dumping the objects in the domain, allowing an adversary to start enumerating all the domain information, including the domain computers, any domain users, any password policy that you might have, etc., etc. So that's one of the attacks that you could do from an NTLM relaying perspective. Another thing is, as I mentioned, relaying is not always straightforward. So depending on the protocol, you might be able to perform some of the attacks or not. So this is a nice mind map. Shout out to Hacker Recipes for having this and implementing this. So if you want more information about this, you can check it out on Hacker Recipes. Now, another problem that we have is Active Directory certificate services. Now, ADCS is pretty old technology, but is widely adopted in a lot of organizations. Now, why is that the case? Well, because ADCS allows organizations to do a number of things, including pushing out certificates. For example, if you want to have your workstations automatically connect to a VPN, or maybe automatically connect to the Wi-Fi, well, that's typically certificate-based, so we could use ADCS to push certificates to our clients. Could also use that for code signing, or for smart card authentication, document signing, device authentication, even secure email. So there's a variety of reasons why we want this. ADCS is basically public key infrastructure, so PKI, but Microsoft backed. Now, because this is quite old technology, it shouldn't come as a surprise that there are also some vulnerabilities inside of this. Now, for a while, for a very long time actually, nobody actually did public research on the attack surface on ADCS until in 2021, again, the Spectrops people released a white paper called Certified Pre-Owned, which highlighted a number of ways to elevate privileges in Active Directory, as well as establish persistence in Active Directory as well by abusing specific functionalities of Active Directory certificate services. So a lot of vulnerabilities are documented in the white paper. It's not really worth going over all of these in this presentation because that would take way too much time. So two of the most common vulnerabilities are going to be ADCS web enrollment and misconfigured ADCS templates, which can be used for authentication purposes. Now, why is web enrollment a problem? Well, ADCS web enrollment is an optional feature that domain administrators can install if they decide to have ADCS in their environments. So this is an optional feature. Now, the problem is that this is old technology. So you can imagine that the web enrollment is going to be quite outdated as well. By default, web enrollment is going to register itself on a web page, which is going to be served over HTTP, so not HTTPS, and supports NTLM authentication, allowing us to potentially relay SMB, right, to the Active Directory Certificate Service web portal to request authentication certificates, allowing adversaries to potentially, worst case scenario, allowing them to relay to the ADCS web enrollment server as a domain controller, giving us authentication certificates on behalf of the domain controller. So we actually have a little bit of a video here as well to showcase that. So here we are going to once again set up NTLM relaying. We are targeting the web enrollment service. And now that we have that set up, we need to coerce authentication. So once again, we have a number of ways of doing that, including that petit potam tool that I talked about. So here we are coercing that auth. You're going to see that that auth works and that we are going to be requesting a new authentication certificate on behalf of, in this case, the domain controller. After a while, you're going to see a base64, there you go, encoded certificate, which we can then copy paste. And we can then use other tools like Rubius, for example, or Certify to request a authentication certificate on behalf of that user, allowing us to authenticate as, for example, the domain controller to compromise that entire organization as well. So I'm going to fast forward here a little bit. You can see that we have Rubius in this case, where we are going to pass the ticket to get a granting ticket for the domain controller. And once we have that ticket imported, we will be using Mimikatz to dump the ntds.dit, specifically the KRB TGT account, allowing us to compromise the entire domain there as well. Other vulnerabilities, sensitive information pretty much everywhere. And that's a problem in a lot of organizations as well. A lot of organizations have, for example, file shares or maybe web applications that have a lot of sensitive information out there, either completely in plain text, maybe in environment variables, or maybe just specific documentation, giving us insights in internal procedures. In some cases, we even found not Active Directory, but CI/CD pipelines, like for example Jenkins, which had open account registration, allowing us to create a new account and just log in as that new user to interact with continuous integration workflows within organizations, which obviously is not great, right? As that could allow adversaries to poison product updates, to start injecting malicious codes, and a variety of other evil things. Another vulnerability is password reuse, right? So even though we have domain joined accounts, we also have local accounts on computers. And the default local account, which always exists on a computer, is the local administrator account. Now, the local administrator account, surprise, surprise, gives you admin rights on that particular machine. Now, it's not uncommon in organizations that local admin passwords are being shared across a variety of systems, sometimes even all of the systems. Now, obviously, this is very problematic because if an adversary is able to get the credentials of a local admin account, which would take one particular workstation or server being compromised. They could then try to pass the hash, right, and to try to authenticate using that NTLM hash across a variety of other machines. So if that password is being reused, that means that we as adversaries now have the capabilities to cross-compromise a number of servers and workstations, sometimes even all of the servers and workstations, effectively leading to a full domain compromise. And then weak service account passwords, that's also a classic one. So a number of years ago, a SANS instructor by the name of Tim Dean actually came up with an attack to attack Active Directory itself, and they called it curb roasting. Now, what this particular technique allows us to do is it allows us as adversaries to abuse the fact that service accounts typically have weak passwords. Now, there's a variety of reasons why that's the case. Sometimes people are scared to change the password. Sometimes people might not even know that some of the software they installed created a service account with a weak password. And what this allows adversaries to do is it allows them to request service tickets for those service accounts. Now, a service ticket will have a user portion and a client portion, a server portion, and the server portion will have been encrypted with the service account's password. So if we can start requesting service tickets, we can then try to brute force our way into the server portion of that ticket. And if we are successful, that means that we have successfully compromised a particular service account. Now, this could be problematic because service accounts could be privileged in the environment. So if you can compromise a service account that has elevated permissions in the domain, that could lead to full domain compromise as well. And then the classic one, right? Default configurations and passwords. Worst case scenario, we are able to authenticate using admin to some kind of logon portal which contains sensitive information. Sometimes we're able to access databases using the built-in SA account, right? So system administrator account. A very common password would be SA username, password, same, would be SA. So with SA, we sometimes are able to log into databases, allowing us to either get code execution on the database or have full read and write privileges on the database, allowing us to pillage all the data, or if we are malicious, we could even start modifying data in there as well. And then we also have misconfigured objects in Active Directory, right? So that's a very common one as well. Active Directory is large. Misconfigurations tend to happen on large and complex environments. So running tools like Bloodhound and Pingcastle are going to help you identify misconfigurations so that you don't have to hire external consultants to do this for you, because they will do exactly the same thing. They would run Bloodhound, identify misconfigurations, and then start to try and abuse those misconfigurations to elevate their permissions. So how do we fix some of these issues, right? Disabling IPv6 is a very straightforward one. If you're not using it internally, simply turn it off on your systems. Same thing with the print spooler service, right? If you're not going to be sending print jobs to your domain controllers, might be a good idea to turn off the print spooler. Now, getting rid of LMNR and NBNS is also going to help, but that of course requires you to potentially upgrade your environment, right? If you still have legacy systems that require LMNR and NBNS, that's not going to be very efficient, as that might break things. So at the very least, if you can get rid of it, get alerts when poisoning start happening, right? So you could set up a honeypot that is going to, at random intervals, send LMNR or NBNS requests with bogus requests, like I definitely shouldn't exist.company.local, right? Nobody should ever reply to that. If something replies to that, you should get an alert saying, hey, someone is trying to poison the network. Enabling LDAP binding and LDAP signing, and channel binding and SMB signing is a very big one. I highly recommend doing that, as that is going to get rid of those NTLM relaying attacks. Implementing local admin password solution and group managed service accounts are going to help you get rid of that password reuse that we talked about and potentially weak service account passwords as well. Another one that I would recommend, if you can, is removing local admin rights from your employees. It should be very rare that an employee needs local admin rights to do anything, right? Typically speaking, if they need to install software, they could submit some kind of IT service management ticket to get that software installed. Or maybe you have a company portal, maybe you're using Intune or some other configuration management portal that allows you to select a list of approved software that can be automatically installed without them needing to have local admin rights. Now, the reason why we want to get rid of local admin rights for normal users is because if an adversary is able to compromise a normal user account and they are local admin, it's pretty trivial to get full local admin access on that system, completely compromising that system. If we remove local admin rights, we're going to increase the difficulty for adversaries to find a way to get that local privilege escalation. And then another tip that I can give is, as an organization, run bloodhounds. Run bloodhound yourselves and identify and remediate attack path before they actually get exploited, right? Again, if you don't do this and you hire an internal pen testing team, and even some red teamers will run bloodhound and will just find those attack paths and abuse them for you, right? The only difference here is that you now have to pay consultants to get that done for you instead of you doing that yourself. Reviewing your Active Directory certificate services settings is going to help. Make sure that your templates are properly configured. Make sure that you don't have web enrollment turned on, or if you do, make sure to, at the very least, migrate to an HTTPS website instead of HTTP. And if you can get rid of the NTLM authentication, that would be great as well. And then, of course, last but not least, if at all possible, implement multi-factor authentication wherever you can, preferably with biometrics, as that is going to reduce the amount of hassle that your employees will have to go through as well, right? If they simply have to authenticate with their thumbprint, that's very easy. If they have to take out their phone, fill out a code, press accept, that takes longer, right? And biometrics is secure, right? So you're combining ease of use and security, so why not? It's a win all around. All right, that was it. I hope that this gave you some insight on some of the common vulnerabilities in organizations. Of course, if you have any questions, if you have any remarks, or if you're just interested in hiring me and my team to do an assessment, feel free to reach out either via email, via LinkedIn, or via Twitter, or wherever you can find me. I will do my best to answer you in appropriate time. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in another webcast.